2 U.S. officials and a member of Congress have confirmed that the ISIS-K suicide bomber who killed 13 U.S. soldiers and 10 Afghan civilians in an attack at the Kabul airport in August was released from a prison at Bagram Air Base just days before the attack. The bomber was held at the Afghan-run Parwan prison and was released when the U.S. abandoned the base in late July, and it was taken over by the Taliban just 11 days before the terrorist attack.
Meanwhile, new reporting from The Intercept shows the U.S. prioritized the evacuation of a group of CIA-backed commandos named the Zero Unit, even as other vulnerable Afghan civilians like military employees, human rights activists, and aid workers were left behind. Some 7,000 Zero Unit members and their families were given refuge in the U.S., despite concrete evidence of the group's war crimes.
So you have a pretty nuanced take on this. We were discussing it a little bit before we did the segment. Give us a little bit about how you're breaking this down.
Well, so it comes back to the question of whether or not you want to stay in Afghanistan forever.
Right.
Right. So
yes.
if you leave Afghanistan and you lose the war to the Taliban, which, as we have learned, despite the assurances of our generals, those were one and the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, there was no Afghan government, national army, or police force that was going to stand up without infinite support, both in terms of troops and money, from the United States. Mm-hmm. So when we leave, the situation collapses. When the situation collapses, Taliban's going to take over the prisons, and the Taliban is going to, free anybody who's in there, associated with, being captured on a battlefield.
Yeah.
And so, if you invade and occupy a country and then you lose the war, you're going to risk these types of things happening. So don't invade and occupy other countries unless you want to risk these types of things happening. Now, of course. So Bagram Air Base, was evacuated as part of the withdrawal, the retreat
Yes.
out of Afghanistan,
and evacuated when it was by the Biden administration's withdrawal sort of strategy.
Right. But then the other question is, could ISIS-K have found somebody to strap on a suicide
Certainly.
vest? It's like, so it's an interesting and tragic coincidence that this person was, escaped from this prison 11 days earlier.
Yeah.
But it's not as if it was the thing that facilitated the ability of ISIS-K to launch an attack. That's just part of war.
Yeah, Ryan, I think the nuance in your perspective is really helpful because it gets to the fundamental driving force between every bit of news that we see coming out of Afghanistan, which is this question of, do you want to stay in Afghanistan forever, and the inevitable casualties of a withdrawal. I think the argument that a withdrawal was never going to be smooth is absolutely 100% correct. And then on the other hand, stories like this underscore that I think there were things the Biden administration did that heightened the casualties, that heightened the risks, that heightened the problems with the withdrawal. And that's why this story is representative of the broader problems with the war and with the withdrawal. And if you want to stay in Afghanistan forever, you're going to have to admit that there's going to be inevitable casualties. And if you don't want to stay in Afghanistan forever, you have to admit there's going to be inevitable casualties in the withdrawal. It's the tragedy of this 2-decade-long endless war that seems to finally have an end. But this story, I do think, represents that.
Right.
Well, sadly.
Right, and at some point, if you're leaving Afghanistan, you're going to have to leave Bagram.
Yes,
and
at some point.
And at some point, that's very likely going to be just a little bit before you leave Kabul, just because of the way that the logistics work. That Bagram's way too far outside of Kabul to be a place, where you can safely move people from Kabul out to Bagram. It's like 40 miles of open road that could just turn into a traffic jam of death, and destruction the entire way. So at some point, and then if you don't get out immediately, the people who are then able to escape are now, you're now vulnerable to them. So that's why you got to get out as quickly as possible. The other option, if you're staying, is the Zero Unit people. So Zero Unit were these death squads that were running around Afghanistan. The Intercept, as exposed, were massacring children in schools even. if there was some hint or some like informer claiming that there was some connection to the Taliban, and so this was going on for years. And in order to keep this occupation going, this is what we had decided we were going to do.
Exactly. And that's why this story is so representative. If you want to stay in Afghanistan forever, you're going to continue allying with pretty bad people, doing pretty disgusting things. And if you want to get out, you're taking serious risks. Yeah. To the point about Bagram, I would say there were a whole lot of people that weren't evacuated, who should have been evacuated, and secondly, that were put at risk because of that. And secondly, when you look at the situation, you see the incompetence of our military and our lawmakers and our leaders who had no idea how quickly the situation would devolve and how severely it would devolve that quickly. And so that's where, again, I think we saw these needless risks because of our military leaders' incompetence in understanding exactly how bad the situation on the ground was. And so this is inevitable, sadly true. Also, it was worsened by the administration.
Yeah, and it also shows the way in which their training in bureaucratic warfare harmed the military, because one of the go-to tactics of a bureaucratic infighter is to slow walk. And so you're not going to disobey orders, but what you're going to do is you're going to stall them as long as you can. And so the military was not refusing to plan effectively to withdraw from Afghanistan, but they just weren't getting to it very quickly, and they weren't putting their best people on it because they thought that if they don't have a clear and effective plan for getting everybody out, then they're going to be able to kind of goad the administration into staying longer and just keep kicking the can down the road. Well, we're not quite ready. Yeah. We're not. It's not that we're saying we need to stay forever, but let's stay for 6 more months so that we can, continue to work on this, that, and the other thing. But in fact, they're trying to stay forever, just in 6-month increments. And then when the go time comes, like, no. When we say we're leaving, we're actually leaving. They're like, oh, we don't have the plan's completely ready for that. Well, that was your job. So,
and to that point, which is a very good point, it's not even just that they wanted to keep staying in 6-month increments. It's also that their alternative was, well, we can stay in a lower capacity on it. We can scale back and stay forever. And that was an argument that was legitimately trotted out by serious writers and journalists and observers and analysts of the military in the wake of the withdrawal. It was, well, we can stay there forever, and it won't be an endless war because the scale of our occupation will be smaller and the scale of our military presence will be smaller. And that's what they were, I think, definitely banking on. None of this means that Joe Biden's decision was wrong, but it does mean that, was their incompetence in its execution.
Yep, and that withdrawal shook that argument out of the bushes. Yeah. It forced people to say out loud that, no, we actually do want to stay forever, but just with fewer troops.
That's a great way to say it.
And endless money.
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll have more Rising right after this.